Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here and so lovely to see so many women students interested in quantitative methods, math, statistics, and so on. So I really thank ICTS for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to showcase some of the applications, I would say, of maths and statistics to understanding the natural world and ecological sciences. And I know that you're doing really hardcore and high-level methods and learning a lot of maths here. So this is going to be very basic in terms of the maths, so you don't need to worry about that. I want you to more pay attention to what is the whole process of hypothesis building and testing in ecological sciences. So today I'm going to talk about some work which has been a lot of bungling in the jungle with a lot of students. And it's obviously been a lot of fun, as you can understand, with its own problems. But this is based on work that I've done in the Western Himalaya, which covers the states of Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Jammu and Kashmir, which is a very exciting bird area. And I'm looking at principally the whole change that the landscape is undergoing, the transformation of the landscape, and what it's doing to birds. I work at the Department of Environmental Studies. So what is the Anthropocene? Have any of you heard the term before, Anthropocene? Yes? Okay, so now it is a very commonly used term. It is basically comes from the Greek word anthropos, which means human being. And this new term has been proposed for this era where the impacts of human beings are quite intense, and sometimes they are overwhelmingly more important than the natural processes themselves. And pretty much the role of mankind has become central in ecology and biology. And I'll explain some of the ways in which this is true. So one of the issues that I'm interested in looking at, of course, the Anthropocene has seen a lot of different impacts like pollution or agricultural change, transformation of landscapes. What I'm really interested in is forest loss and degradation. So I'm sure that all of you are coming from many different states. You would have noticed forests around you, right? How many of you notice trees and forests around you when you near your home or near your educational institution? Are there a lot of forests in your academic surroundings? That's great. It's good to hear that. I think the academic institutions are one of the saviors of our nature. But forest loss and degradation, if you look at it from a landscape perspective, or India-wide perspective, we do have a lot of area under forests. 19% of our area is considered to be under forests. However, a lot of it is degraded now. And for various reasons, including overexploitation, for instance, people in our country are still heavily dependent on forests. So they use a lot of products, including leaves. As you can see, these women collecting leaves for their cattle. And then there's grazing. There's a lot of use of fire in these ecosystems, which sometimes goes out of hand because fire is used to generate new grass in many of these places. One very recent phenomenon is monocultures and plantations. You see here a eucalyptus plantation in West Bengal and a teak plantation in Uttarakhand. Basically, what you're doing is you are changing the forest, which is a very complex system because it has many trees, it has a complex structure, into a simplified structure like a monoculture, which is only one species, like teak. And we have many other types of plantations coming up in India now. And this is one major cause of forest degradation today. We also have urbanization. We can see that urban sprawl is extending into the countryside. It's affecting the natural systems there, the lakes and the forests, because there's really no planning. Here you can see how homes and tourist complexes are just being built randomly wherever possible. So that affects, when you have concrete then birds and other biodiversity response to that. And here you can see IIT Powai, which is very green, and the onslaught of the urbanization, which has been kept at bay for the time being. So in this context, I decided to study birds, and a lot of my colleagues also in different institutions are studying birds because there's so much change happening. But why study birds? As you can see, they're very colorful. They're extremely interesting. If you sat down to observe birds, they show a lot of different behaviors. They're very noisy. They have a whole lot of, they produce many different kinds of calls. Here you can see 3 different species from the Himalayas where I work. You can see that they have pretty interesting names as well, right? Fire-breasted, flower-pecker, and spot-winged grosbeak, and so on, yeah. So they're very good environmental indicators as well, and that has been found to be true across the board. So the central question in our work over the last 10, 15 years is to look at how forest birds are responding to the kind of change that we are subjecting them to, right? How is this change happening, and how can we quantify it? Why is it important to quantify? Because we need to reach out to planners, to policymakers, to the government to help them understand. It's not enough to just say, okay, birds are disappearing or this bird is increasing. Recently, we found that peacocks are actually increasing all over the country, but other birds are decreasing, like the sparrow, right? So these things are not believable until you come up with numbers, and that's the reason a lot of us are working on this issue. So the more theoretical questions that this can be related to are to understand how do so many birds actually coexist in a given site. Okay, because there are so many questions in ecology. This is one of the central questions about biodiversity. How is biodiversity maintained? And then how does that balance of biodiversity, how that changes when humans impact the ecosystem? So that is a central question that we are looking at. And for this, I've been working in the forests of the Kumaon region in Western Himalayas. You can see that this is just a sample of the kind of very diverse ecosystems which are present. I don't know how many of you in school would have taken courses in biology and ecology. How many of you are familiar with biological concepts? Great. Okay, it's part of your science coursework, right? Yeah. So these are ecosystems that are quite distinct from each other because of the kind of species there are, the kind of ecological processes going on. You can see sal forest, subtropical. These are graded according to the altitude at which they are mostly present. And how do we work on birds? So there are many ways of studying birds. There are acoustic recording. There is trapping and marking. We have principally been using observational techniques. And the method that we've used largely is fixed radius point count method, because this is really appropriate to the Himalayas, which are a very difficult terrain. If any of you have been there, it's not easy to do anything there. You have to be really careful. And usually we have 2 observers. And we try to take as many temporal or time-wise replicates as possible. I know you've been looking at the issue of sampling in this course. And temporal replication is absolutely necessary because you can understand there's a lot of variation in nature, right? A lot of variance. If you take any particular variable, you'll see a very wide fluctuation in that variable. So in order to understand that kind of variation and to deal with it, we need lots of replicates, right? And at least 2 seasons, winter and summer, because what happens in the winter is very different from what birds do in the summer. So again, that variation has to be taken into account. And then you need multiple years of observation, right? Again, to encompass the variability in that particular data, because every year differs from the previous in the kind of rainfall that has happened, the kind of drought that is, the humidity, the temperatures, and so on. So we need to take all that into account. Unfortunately, there's usually not enough funding and not enough time to cover a very large number of years, but people who've been lucky with this have been able to do it over 10 to 12 years. So let me take you through one small example of just looking at land use change and biodiversity. So the land uses that we're talking about in the Himalaya in a particular altitude is the oak forest, which is one of the prettiest and most diverse systems that you can get in the Himalayas. You see it on the top left. And then you see degraded oak, which is in this state because of overcollection and overuse of timber as well as fuel wood. And then you have lopped oak, which means that the canopy or the trees have been basically cut and all you have is the shrubbery and the saplings that are growing on the ground. So these are three land uses I want you to keep in mind. And then you have the pine forest. The pine forest is another very interesting system. Some of you may have gone to Mussoorie and Simla and so on and seen so much of pine forest there because it's now a dominating forest type there. And then you have cultivation and built up sites. And the reason I'm showing you all these land use types is because we have a lot of bird data from these land use types to figure out what happens to birds when you convert forests into cultivation or forests into built up sites or degrade them and so on. One of the big issues in this part of the Himalayas in Uttarakhand is the replacement of dense oak forest by cheer pine forest, which means that a very complex, structurally complex and species-rich system is being converted to pine, which, as you can see, is made up of only pine trees with a few things in the understory. Right? And so this is very important. This is happening all over, and some of our studies indicate that the area of pine has increased by almost 35%. And it's leading to, it's because of the canopy opening up, the climate change impacts, it's getting warmer in the Himalayas. This species is very drought tolerant and it grows easily in poor soils, and that's one of the reasons it's taking over from oak. So just want to give you a flavor for what's happening out there in terms of birds. You can see some basic bar graphs here. On the y-axis, you have number of species per site. Yeah. And on the x-axis, we have these 6 land uses that I've told you about. And each of these bars, just along with the standard error bar, shows you the variation in that number of species per site based on several sites per land use type, right? And there are 2 landscapes adjoining each other to check if the same pattern holds out between the 2 landscapes. Okay. So you can see what's happening over here. The natural oak, as you can see, has the largest number of species, and there is some amount of variation there. Are the 2 landscapes similar in terms of the patterns? Landscape A and landscape B that you see in 2 different colors, are the same patterns holding out? Anyone can put up your hand and tell me? And what's the error bar indicating? I know it's a completely different system and it's going to take time for you to absorb all that's happening. But yeah, you can see the general pattern for the red and the blue bars is very similar, right? Of course, in ecology data, this can be considered as a pretty clear pattern because there's so much variance in the data, right? You can see that natural oak is definitely more than all of these other, it's richer in species than all of these other land uses. And all these other land uses, interestingly, are very similar. You know, when you degrade an oak forest, it principally has a similar amount of species as pine and in agriculture as in built up areas. And built up areas, which are areas basically with a lot of human habitations, tourist resorts, and so on, those have the fewest species. Okay, and the way that we can actually conclude this is because the sample size is very similar across all of these land use types. The amount of time we spent in each of these is the same. So everything else is standardized. All you're looking at is the final species number over many replicates. Okay. Any questions? Please feel free to put up your hand and ask questions through the talk. Yeah. Yes, yeah, it's much bigger, much wider. That's a good observation. Uh, we really don't know. We actually expected it to be the other way around because landscape B has a lot more forest in general in the landscape compared to landscape A. So it's hard to explain that, but yeah, there's generally more in landscape B. The other reason landscape B could have more variation is because there were fewer samples in landscape B than landscape A in terms of number of spatial replicates. So point counts done over space, right? It was only 10 in case of landscape B and 23 in case of landscape A. So you can understand that's a good point. The more you sample, the more you're able to bring down your variance. And that's pretty much a thumb rule in ecology or in any other science. And what we were looking for is to, about the pine forest, our a priori hypothesis about pine forests being much less rich in birds, given their very simplified structure and their recent emergence in the landscape, it holds only 51 to 64% of the species, as in dense oak. And if we look at if we break up the species into insectivores, which are insect-eating birds, and pollinating birds, which are nectar feeding. So you have these small birds like sunbirds and flower peckers that I showed you earlier that go to flowers and feed on the nectar. And in the process, they pollinate flowers. So there are about 5 species of those. Of insectivores, we have almost 50 to 60 species, right? So the same thing we've done in the different land uses, but now we've looked at pollinators and at insectivores separately. And what you see there, a very similar pattern to the overall bird richness that we saw earlier. But the effect is much more in the case of these particular groups of birds. So then you start wondering, why is it that insect-eating birds are particularly affected, right? And so are pollinators, obviously. Yeah. So there is a lot of influence on the kind of ecological processes that are going on. Because if you bring the insect-eating birds down to half that you're seeing in degraded lopped and pine and cultivation, and the effect is even more in the built-up sites, you can understand that there will be a lot of insects in the forest that won't be preyed on, right? There will be a lot of population explosions of insects that might go and harm human habitations or human agriculture, right? So these things have consequences for human well-being as well. This is another method which gets really interesting, and this is based on, it's called non-metric multidimensional scaling, and this is a very interesting method based on randomization, which is very useful in ecology, because in ecology, I'm sure that all of you have studied parametric statistics, right, to start with, which is really the classical statistics where you need a lot of assumptions, right? Can you think of some assumptions when we do a comparison of means, for instance? What is one assumption? Sorry, you haven't done your stats as yet, right, in this workshop. So what non-parametric multidimensional scaling does, it takes us away from those assumptions of parametric statistics. It is based on randomization. So what it does is it tries to figure out the species composition of each of these land use types. And you can see each of these land use types in different colors here. And it's named also degraded forest, natural forest. And what you see here is basically you start with a matrix of species versus site. And then that matrix literally gives you everything. All you do is you keep iterating, you keep randomly sampling that matrix, and you come up with a species composition for each site. So each of these symbols indicates one site where all the sampling has been done, and the size of the circle of one site indicates the amount of variability in the species composition, which means what are the birds existing there and at what numbers, right? So basically what you're finding here, the distance of each of these circles from each other indicates the difference, okay? And what you can see here is that natural forest is very different from everything else, and everything else is quite distinct, but the lopped forest that I showed you earlier, where the trees are cut down right down to the stump, are very similar to the pine in terms of the species that are there. And tourism, I mean the built up areas, this is completely different. It has birds which come in and feed because people are also there. There's a lot of garbage, there's food around, there are different artificial sources of food, right? So this is a really, and now of course you can do these methods just on the software, but it's very good to understand what exactly is going into these calculations. And it's basically a lot of, randomization, randomized simulations. These are done about 10,000 times and you come up with this number, which is its location on two different axes. And this is a form of principal component analysis, which is a multivariate method. Right? I think you will learn that much later in your maths. And why is that difference there, right? You would say, why are built-up sites so different from natural forest, and why are agricultural sites so different from degraded forest, right? It's because you have a lot of forest specialist birds, okay? These are two birds that just feed inside forest and they nest inside forest. You won't see them in the village or in the cultivation areas, right? And of course, we have a lot of colorful birds like this, which are specialists. The insectivores that I was talking about, there are two examples here. One is the black-faced warbler, which is a really small bird in black and yellow that moves around in groups, and you have a large maroon oriole. See the kind of vegetation that they're in. It's very dense forest with a lot of complexity. And that's what you need to take back with you, how there is so much more complexity in forest compared to agriculture and pine and degraded forest. So once you see a lot of difference across land uses, the question then is, why is this happening, right? Any normal person would say, okay, so why are these species behaving the way they are? Right? And so for this, we tried to look at the resources inside the forest as to what these birds actually feed on, what trees do they select to sit on, to roost on, and so on. And for this, a student of mine worked on woodpeckers in Uttarakhand, which is, woodpeckers are a very interesting species. Have any of you seen woodpeckers? Have you noticed how it is different from other birds? How is it different from normal birds that you see hopping in your garden? You can put your hand up and ask. They stay on the trees, right? They stick to the bark of the trees and they climb up and down rapidly. It's quite amazing how they're able to move, because that the way they feed is to feed on insects from the bark, right? So these are two examples. The left, there's the great slaty woodpecker, which is the largest woodpecker in the world, which lives all along the foothills of the Himalaya, and the rufous woodpecker, which is found all over India. Again, for this study, we looked at land use, different land uses. We have different types of forest based on management history. There's a tree called the sal tree, which is one of the tallest trees in India. It is, its wood is very important. It was used for railway sleepers during British times, right? So these forests of sal are heavily managed since British times and up to about 1990s. So we found 4 different categories of forests with very different looking structure. We have natural sal, which is composed of undisturbed sal stands, which are very old, tall trees. You get young managed sal, which consists of regeneration, younger trees that have grown since the last harvest, and the old managed sal, which has experienced selective logging, where a few mature trees are kept and the rest are logged, but the felling had stopped 30 years ago. So you again see a lot of young trees and a few old trees. So slightly more complex than the young managed sal. And then the teak plantations, which are actually not native to the area. Teak is native to India, but it is exotic to this area where we were working. So this is the first result I want to just show you. These are called species effort curves. Again, it's a very simple kind of a thing, but extremely useful to understand species diversity. So in this, you basically what you do is on the x-axis, you have sampling rounds. So every time you go to a particular site and you record birds, you note down how many new species you saw. So supposing you saw 3 woodpecker species the first time around, in your second sampling round, you saw 5 and so on. And then you keep going till it starts leveling off, okay? And every symbol over there indicates a sampling round. Every color of this plot line graph shows a different land use. So the greens show natural sal, the red and the blue symbols show the managed sal, and the purple is indicating teak, the teak plantations. Okay. So first of all, why do you think these graphs would saturate? Why do they level off? Can you think of any other phenomenon where the variable levels off after repeated sampling? Any other example you've covered in your coursework? Not just maths, but biology or chemistry? Huh? Yeah, very good. Yeah. So it's because, and why would it happen in a forest? Exactly. And you can only have a certain number of bird species of a given type. The woodpeckers all use tree bark and they live in the dense forest, and they use very specific resources like cavities and insects. So there's a limit to how many species of woodpeckers you can have in a forest. And that's why it's saturating. And the last point where it saturates is where you consider to be the natural species richness in that habitat. So for natural sal, it's leveling off at around 12, and both of these around 11 and 12, and these young and old managed sal are leveling off at around 9 to 10. And the teak forest is leveling off at a very small number of around 7 or 8. So this is a very interesting way to compare habitats, right, and compare diversity. So earlier we were asking what maintains this diversity, right? So, so some clues we got from this very basic graph, which shows the number of woodpeckers that you observe in a particular amount of time in a given amount of area, which is quantified as a density, number of individuals per kilometer. And on the x-axis, you have the 4 land use types, right? The greens, the dark boxes are from the breeding season, and the reds are from the non-breeding season, which is winter. Okay, they breed in the summer because there are a lot more resources available in the summer, right? So what are these plots called? Have any of you seen these kind of plots before? Yeah, very good. Yeah, these are very useful because you can see what is the central box. It shows you the central tendency, could be the median mostly, right? And then the 2 bars show you the variance in the data, right? So there's a lot of variance, of course, because we have a lot of samples. And so you can see what is the pattern you can see here. I want you to show me 3 different results from this graph. Yeah, there's a lot of difference between breeding and non-breeding season. The difference between natural sal and the rest of the habitats, which are the modified habitats, is much more in the breeding season than in the non-breeding season, which is winter, during the winter counts. Why do you think that would be? But overall, natural sal is doing better than all of the other land uses, which is same result as we found in the previous example. But why do you think that would happen? Why in the breeding season so much difference between natural sal and the other modified habitats? More resources needed because the birds are nesting. They have to bring up a lot of chicks. They have to find insects and supply them. So they tend to stick to the better forest because that's where they get more insects. And the rest of the year, they don't really care. They go all over. They just have to maintain themselves. They can roost anywhere and feed anywhere. So when we started out this particular case study, I said, let's look at why certain habitats are poorer in species than others when you manipulate habitats. And here you can see a very interesting graph. On the y-x-axis, you have bill size, which is basically an indicator of the size of the woodpecker, which goes from 10 millimeters all the way to 70 millimeters. And these are the largest woodpeckers on the right side. On the y-axis, we have the diameter of the foraging tree. So based on the natural history of woodpeckers, we figured out that it's very important to look at the size of the trees, right? The bigger species will want to alight and feed on larger trees because there's a higher probability of them feeding themselves adequately, right? It's the optimal foraging theory. So diameter of the foraging tree, which is indicated by in centimeters there. So what do you see here? This is one of the most interesting findings we have because very few ecology graphs actually look so clear and which have such a clear pattern, right? So a very strong correlation between variable X and variable Y, right? So is it an increasing trend or a declining trend? Increasing, right? And the correlation is very high. It is also significant at p equals 0.001, right? So each of these dots indicates a species. And again, the plots show the variance around that particular species in terms of the diameter of tree that it feeds on. But on the average, you can see that the larger woodpeckers feed on larger trees. And that gives us a clue as to why teak plantations don't have that many woodpeckers, because they are plantations, they don't have those large trees. And the managed forest also don't have so many trees, large trees. So the message here is that we need to protect our forests with the entire size range of trees if you want to protect all of the species that occur in that area, right? So that's one of our nice findings recently. What do the patterns overall suggest? Basically, we find that there's a reduction in bird numbers and bird species because of human-caused changes, such as urbanization, management of forest, and degradation, right? But we also find that species are affected differently. There's a lot of nuance in species biology. Some species really respond, they are affected drastically by habitat change. Other species are more adaptable. And that's why you have that the NMDS graph where you see very different compositions of different land use types. There's also a trend of simplification of ecosystems where you are reducing the complexity because of the way that we use the habitat. We are reducing the structural complexity as well as the species complexity of those areas. And one of the reasons that this is happening could be diminishing resources in terms of trees and insects and so on. In the last part, last 10 minutes, I just want to talk about ecological studies. And I've just tried to give you a flavor for the kind of studies that are done. and how they can be useful for policies and so on for biodiversity. But what makes ecological studies so different from lab studies that many of you may have encountered while you were doing your high school studies, or you've looked at chemistry and so on, biology? One of the things is that there's tremendous natural variability in nature, and this makes field studies really challenging. On the one hand, most of the funding organizations don't really favor field studies because it's expensive. You have to go to the field, you have to set up a field station, you need a vehicle, and it works out pretty expensive. And so most of the government agencies are not willing to give you a lot of money for field work. But at the same time, you need to tackle this natural variability. And as I said earlier, natural variability can only be understood if you have lots and lots of sampling. So the basic thumb rule in ecology is collect as many samples as you can get. And that's what we try to do. You can see this kind of variation in a very simple experiment done by one of my students last year. We looked at the insect abundance. So if we think that insects are important for insectivorous birds, and that's the reason they are affected in human modified habitats, we can see this particular graph where foliage insect abundance is put on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you have the bird abundance. And again, you see a increasing trend there, increasing function. And here the slope is 1.11, and you can see the scatter of points here, right? This is a scatter plot with a regression line, right? It's a bivariate analysis. And you can see that there is a lot of variance around the line, obviously, which is reflected in the R squared. What does the R squared tell you? Amount of variation explained by the by the y variable. So there is only 0.5%, or only 0.5 of the variance is explained by this foliage insect abundance. The rest, there could be other factors affecting insectivore bird abundance that we are not sure about. So that's one of the reasons we are not able to get really clear-cut graphs in ecology. But that makes us think as to what could be the other factors. So you're only looking at X1, which is insect abundance. We want to look at other factors. It could be something to do with predators. It could be something to do with foliage complexity, with the kind of species of trees that are there. Because as you know, different tree species have different kinds of biology. Another graph very similar, where you can see the increasing abundance on the x-axis gives rise to reducing insect bird abundance, which is on the y-axis, right? But however, you can see that the p-value is very low, right? Which means that this relationship is actually significant, statistically significant, right? But the amount of variance explained is quite low, again, 34%. But when you get these values in ecological sciences, you're really jumping for joy, because these are like, don't get these very easily. The other thing is that ecological systems are extremely complex. I've only talked about a simplified part of the ecosystem that we're trying to understand, because there are weather variables, there are interspecies relationships like competition, predation, and symbiosis, which could affect the numbers of a given species in any given area. Human impacts can be quite complex, and they could affect species in a very complicated way that very often we don't understand till it actually happens, right? And global change, things like warming. So how do we get around this kind of complexity, right? When you go to an ecosystem and you are overwhelmed by the kind of species that are there, the whole, the structure of the forest and so on, right? There's a lot that intuition does for you, right? You need to, and for intuition to work, you need to really be in the forest for a while, or in whatever ecosystem you're working. you need to observe everything. You need to spend time in the field. And that's one of the reasons why we go to the field so often. Very often your family members will say, you go and have a good time, and what do you actually do over there? Then it's not easy to explain. You figure out so many things when you're in the field. You realize, okay, there's this predator-prey relationship, or there's this human impact going on that I didn't know before. So then you include it in the bigger model, right, that you're trying to build. And this we saw in the case of mixed species flocks of birds. In the same study site, we looked at social behavior of birds. Again, a system where there are lots of birds feeding together, and insectivorous birds, because they help each other. They tend to flock together, they feed together, because as you can see, the birds on the top in the canopy are they are supported by, they gain from the insects coming out, because a lot of birds are feeding together, so they flush out insects for each other. So it is supposed to have a benefit for everyone. They also benefit from anti-predator kind of sentries that kind of tell them when a predator is coming. So there are more birds looking out for predators, right? So there are these advantages to mixed flocks. And for this system, we drew up a little bit of a basic hypothesis about why they should change when you have degradation, forest degradation. And the basic hypothesis was that you have forest disturbance of various kinds, including monocultures and all. This might reduce the foliage arthropod abundance. Arthropods includes insects and spiders. And this forest disturbance could then affect the insectivorous bird abundance through reducing the arthropods, and also directly, because there could be physical disturbance, there could be structural disturbance to the forest, which reduces certain niches for the birds. And this insectivore abundance then reduces the richness, because if you look at it in probabilistic terms, the more birds there are, the more likely it is that you will have more species as well. And this is known to reduce your richness. And then that again reduces your flock richness, because when there are fewer species, they don't tend to have that behavior that helps everybody. They reduce the number of birds that can actually feed together. So this is our initial hypothesis. And then when we collected field data over 4 months and did a structural equation model, we could see that whatever we thought was turning out right, except for one of these relationships, which was this one here. The PC1 scores indicate the vegetation disturbance. So this was not affecting insectivore abundance directly, but it was affecting through reducing insects in the forest. And that reduced the number of flocks encountered. And again, this causal pathway turned out to be true. You can see the p-values here and so on. So this is just basically multivariate relationships that are tested using regression models, right? The third reason that it's the third way in which ecology is very different from lab experiments is that one data point can take much, much longer than in a lab experiment. So this graph that I showed you earlier, it is based on 320 hours in the field over 2 years of sampling, right? So it's not easy. It's a difficult subject to do, but you can do only if you're really interested in being in nature and spending time in nature. And of course, natural conditions can be physically, ecological studies can be physically taxing. On the left, that's a picture from my PhD days. We're having lunch in the forest with my batchmate. And we're basically eating bread and tuna fish out of cans, because that's all we had. We were about 40 kilometers from anywhere. And so it's not easy to do, but somehow when you're in the field and things are getting so interesting, you're willing to go out and spend that time. field conditions can be quite difficult. There can be unpredictable disruptions because of weather, because of your equipment breaking down in a remote place where you can't really have it fixed, right? And yet, field ecology has its amazing rewards too. You can be one with nature. You're in these beautiful places where you can watch sunsets every day. And of course, you can see a lot of very interesting species that you try to record and understand as much as you can, because you'll never get the chance again to go to these exciting places, right? So just wanted to briefly talk about all of these students and collaborators who've been doing all of this work from different institutions. These are people who are crazy about being in the field, about analyzing data, and they are all over the country. We collaborate across different institutions to work on the data that we are collecting. Most of the work has been supported from DST, Women Scientist Award, and the DST programs for postdoctoral fellows and so on. We also have a lot of NCBS and Tata Trust grants to some of the students, Nature Conservation Foundation in Bengaluru, and Uttarakhand Forest Department, which allows us to go to these areas and sample birds and do a lot of other things. We also run a lot of projects on trees, trying to understand why the projects. So initially, I talked about how oak is changing to pine, right? So we're trying to figure out why that is happening using experiments in the field, looking at the seedling regeneration, the saplings, and so on. So I end here and happy to take questions and comments and any other thoughts that you might have on this work.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an informative talk. So do we have any questions from the audience?
I think there's a lot of new stuff and probably hard to absorb so much at one go. But yeah.
In one of the slides, you had a degree of human disturbance.
Yes, yes.
How is that measured exactly?
Good question. So we were able to measure human disturbance by observing how people use the landscape. And then we were able to come up with certain indicators. So basically things like how many stumps there are, tree stumps. So if you have 20 trees, how many of those are lopped to the ground? How open is the canopy? Because opening of the canopy indicates kind of degradation. So using all of those, so we came up with a multivariate technique called principal components analysis that you may have heard of.
Yeah.
So you come up with, you basically do an ordination using PCA or any other, we can use NMDS also, and come up with axes, the ones that explain the data a lot. Those are, we use those particular points as the values, as the disturbance indicator.
Thank you.
Because there's so many things going on in the landscape, you see, you need something to summarize all those effects into one value. So,
thank you.
Sure.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, so let's thank us.
Yeah, yes.
I have a sort of general question.
Yeah.
There's ecology and there's ornithology.
Yes, yes.
Can we really separate the two in this, do you think, in this current Anthropocene age?
So ecology is a much more general term, and it includes the study of birds as well, but more, it's more about looking at the relationship of birds with their environment. So, but ornithology, so I would say both of those are like, have a kind of a common area of ecology. So ornithology has some ecology and ecology has some ornithology. So they're not totally separate. And yeah, it's a very useful area to look at because there's human impacts are easier to study through birds. As I mentioned, they're very good environmental indicators. So, yeah.
So let us thank the speaker once again.